All right, welcome to the deep dive. This time we're taking a deep dive into What Would Google Do?
By Jeff Jarvis.
By Jeff Jarvis. That's right, a listener sent that in. It's a fascinating book, and
Yeah.
it's a look at how Google's approach could really revolutionize industries
hmm
that you wouldn't normally think of as, tech-related.
Right. You're in for a treat because it's not just about the technology. Jarvis actually says that Google's success
Okay.
comes from a certain mindset, a way of thinking.
So it's more than just algorithms and search results.
It is,
It's
yeah.
a whole approach to
Right.
solving problems. So what is this Google mindset? What are the key principles that he identifies?
Well, one of the, I think, most radical ideas is this idea that Google hands control to the customer.
Hmm.
Like it's all about putting the user at the center, empowering them to shape the product. Think about how Google search works. You type in what you want, and Google delivers the results. They're not trying to guess what you need, they're responding to your query.
That's a good point. It's almost counterintuitive because you think of Google as this massive company, this powerful company, but their whole empire is built on empowering us, the users.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into another principle, embracing openness and transparency.
Okay.
Google thrives on information, making things accessible, searchable. And they really believe that by fostering these open networks and platforms, that they can tap into this like collective wisdom of the crowd.
Okay. So we've got user control, we've got openness. What else? What else makes up this Google mindset?
Well, they're not afraid to experiment and iterate. They're constantly refining their products based on data, based on user feedback.
Yeah.
Think about how often Google tweaks its search algorithms or rolls out new features.
Yeah.
It's all about continuous improvement, not sticking to some rigid plan.
Right, which is very different from the way like traditional businesses have operated, where it's like we're going to predict what customers want and then like stick with it even if it's not working. This is much more, adaptable and willing to evolve.
Absolutely. So how about we see how this mindset plays out in some real-world scenarios?
Hmm.
Jarvis uses some really vivid examples to show how it could shake up industries that
Yeah.
you wouldn't normally think of.
Yeah, I'm all ears. What do we got?
All right, let's take the airline industry. Think about how frustrating it can be. Rigid pricing, limited options, lack of
Oh, we're
personalization.
telling me. We've all had our share of airline headaches.
I hear you. So imagine a world where airlines actually embraced the Google mindset. Jarvis paints this picture of a flight where instead of just staring at the seat in front of you, you're part of a network
Uh,
of your fellow passengers.
Wait, so like a social network, like a
Yes.
site for people on the same flight?
Exactly.
Okay, I
Yeah.
could see that being like kind of interesting, especially for like business travelers or something.
Exactly. You could connect with colleagues who are headed to the same conference, find people with shared interests, maybe strike up a conversation with the person a couple rows ahead of you, and then just think about how valuable all of that data would be for the airline.
So the flight becomes like more than just transportation. It's a social experience.
Yeah.
But how does that translate into actual value for the airline?
Well, imagine if there was an open marketplace for frequent flyer miles,
Ooh.
right? So instead of being these kind of confusing points that are hard to redeem, they become this more valuable currency that you can trade, you could auction them off.
Okay. So you're saying like I could use my miles to like bid on an upgrade or something or trade them
Yeah.
for something completely unrelated to travel. Okay, now you're talking.
Right. And then the airlines could take all of that passenger data and they could use it to create, curated travel guides and recommendations.
Hmm.
So they're essentially turning their customer base into a source of content and insights.
That's a pretty slick idea.
Uh-huh.
So the airlines get valuable insights. Yeah. And we get a more personalized experience.
Win-win.
Win-win.
Fine.
Everybody's happy. Okay, so we talked about airlines. What other industries does Jarvis think that Google could disrupt?
How about real estate? It's another area that's ripe for change.
Oh, yeah. Real estate. I've heard so many horror stories about real estate agents and like those hefty commissions and all that.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
So Jarvis talks about imagining a world where you could just bypass the agent completely.
Really?
He mentions a platform, maybe like a Craigslist, but specifically for real estate, and it connects buyers and sellers directly.
Okay. So you're saying like I could sell my house without an agent? I don't know. That sounds kind of risky, but I'm intrigued.
Okay. So, think about it. There are already services like Zillow that provide a lot of data that both buyers and sellers need to kind of assess like fair market value and stuff.
Right.
But what if you had a platform that actually handled all of the paperwork, offered virtual tours, even like connected you with legal help if you needed it?
So we're unbundling the agent's role.
Exactly.
Okay. And different services are popping up to meet those specific needs.
Precisely.
That is a pretty big shift. But I do like the idea of having more control and transparency throughout the whole process.
And don't forget about, the power of Google Maps and all of those other online resources that you have at your disposal. You could plan out your whole house hunting day. You could, get directions, view photos and videos, even connect with people who live in the neighborhood, all before you even step foot in a single property.
That's pretty amazing. Okay, so we've talked about airlines, real estate. Jarvis also talks about venture capital. Right?
Yes.
It's a whole other world. What does Google have to do with funding startups?
This is where his idea of small is the new big really comes in. Traditional venture capitalists make these big bets on a few select companies, but the internet has made it so much easier to launch a successful business with a lot less money.
Really?
Yeah.
You don't need those millions of dollars in funding anymore.
He uses outside.in as an example.
Yeah.
They were able to organize all of these local blog posts and launch with just $60,000.
Wow.
They leveraged all of these free tools like Google Maps, open source software, and it really proves that you don't need a ton of money to make a big impact.
So how do venture capitalists adapt to this new landscape where small is the new big?
Mm-hmm.
What do they need to do?
Well, Jarvis says they need to become much more open and transparent. So imagine them using blogs and online platforms to actually share their investment strategies and connect with startups. It's about joining the conversation instead of hoarding all of the information.
I can see how that would benefit both sides,
Exactly.
It makes the process less secretive, and it opens doors for a wider range of entrepreneurs to, get their ideas funded.
Absolutely.
Are there any other changes that they need to make?
They need to be willing to invest smaller amounts in a larger number of companies. Because, they need to recognize that the next big thing could be started by anyone, anywhere.
So it's kind of like spread your bets.
Exactly.
Instead of putting all your eggs in one basket.
And they need to really understand net natives, the young entrepreneurs who've grown up with the internet.
Right.
Because they just instinctively understand this landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, about how, the internet is disrupting these traditional power structures. The gatekeepers are losing their grip as information and opportunity become more accessible.
Exactly.
All right. So we've seen how the Google mindset could potentially impact airlines, real estate, venture capital. Are there any areas, though, where Jarvis thinks that Google's influence won't be as strong?
That is a great question, and one that we'll explore next time on The Deep Dive.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been unpacking what would Google do and how this Google mindset could shake things up in areas like airlines, real estate, venture capital. But I'm curious, are there places where it doesn't work as well? Are there areas that might be resistant to this kind of disruption?
Jarvis actually points to a couple of those: public relations and law.
Okay.
He argues that their very structure makes them a bit tougher to Googlefy.
Okay, so let's start with PR.
Okay.
What makes it so resistant to this Google way of thinking? Because it seems like everything's online these days, including PR.
Well, if you think about what PR is really all about, it's about representing clients, right? It's about often spinning information to present them in the best possible light. So, control, carefully crafting a narrative, those are crucial in TR.
Right.
And those kind of clash with Google's emphasis on transparency and openness.
So they're inherently biased, right? They're paid to advocate for their clients, even if that means bending the truth a little bit or hiding some inconvenient facts.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that kind of backfire in the age of Google, where information spreads so quickly and it can be, easily verified?
Exactly. And Jarvis argues that the internet has actually made PR more difficult because it's so much harder to control that message.
Yeah.
You have blogs, you have social media, online forums, everyone has a voice.
Right.
And negative information can go viral in an instant.
So is PR doomed in the Google age? Are they fighting a losing battle here?
Not necessarily doomed, but they definitely need to adapt.
Well,
And Jarvis acknowledges that even PR can benefit from using some of these internet tools. A lot of PR professionals now use blogs and social media to
right.
monitor what's being said about their clients and engage in conversations online.
So it's about adapting their strategies to this new landscape where information just flows so freely.
Yeah.
What would that look like in practice?
Well, he suggests that the best TR strategy in the Google age is actually radical honesty and transparency. So instead of trying to control the narrative, companies should be upfront about their mistakes, engage with their critics, and build trust through authentic communication.
It's a very different perspective
It is.
from the traditional PR approach.
Yeah.
So it sounds like PR needs to evolve beyond spin and embrace a more genuine approach.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about law.
Okay.
Why does Jarvis see that field as resistant to Google's influence? Because it seems like there's a lot of potential there for technology to streamline legal processes and make things more efficient.
Well, like PR, law is often adversarial, right? Lawyers are paid to represent their clients' interests, even if it means being secretive, withholding information, or, engaging in these legal battles that drag on for years.
Right, which again seems very much at odds with Google's principles of, openness and collaboration and easy access to information.
Exactly.
But there must be some room for Google-like disruption in the legal world. I mean, there's got to be, right?
There is potential, and Jarvis points to the rise of things like online legal resources.
Right.
Websites offering free legal advice or simplified versions of legal documents.
So it's kind of like a Wikipedia for law.
Exactly.
That people can access basic information and resources
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily having to hire a lawyer.
Exactly. He also sees potential for platforms that connect people with lawyers who specialize in very specific areas of law, making it easier to find the right legal help.
Right.
And he even suggests the idea of open sourcing legal documents
Mm-hmm.
where people who've been through certain legal battles can share their experiences or resources with others who might be facing similar challenges.
That's a really great idea to make the legal system more transparent and accessible, especially for, people who can't afford expensive legal counsel.
Right.
But can the internet really change the fundamental nature of the legal profession, which is often, so focused on conflict?
That's the key question. And while Jarvis sees room for improvement in terms of transparency and access, he is a little skeptical about whether it can completely overturn that kind of adversarial nature of the profession. It's a system that's deeply ingrained in our society.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about PR and law, two areas where Jarvis sees some resistance to the Google mindset. He also talks about Apple as kind of a unique case, a company that thrives by seemingly breaking a lot of the rules that he lays out in the book.
Yeah.
They're a really fascinating example to look at.
Apple is really interesting because in many ways they're the opposite of Google. They're notoriously secretive.
Right.
They control every aspect of their products, and they really cultivate that sense of scarcity and exclusivity.
Yeah, it's true. They've built a cult-like following by doing things that seem totally counter to the Google mindset, right? They don't give a lot of control to the customer.
Right.
Steve Jobs was famous for being very particular about design and functionality, and they're not exactly known for being open about their plans.
No. And they don't embrace that, open source, community-driven approach at all. They keep their technology closely guarded and their future plans under wraps.
And they're masters at creating hype and excitement, making people feel like they absolutely have to have the latest iPhone or MacBook.
Absolutely.
It's a brilliant strategy from a business standpoint.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem very Google at all.
It's really fascinating. And so Jarvis raises the question, is Apple truly an exception to the rule? Or are there underlying similarities between these two tech giants?
That's a great question, because it seems like they're polar opposites in a lot of ways. So how does he answer that question?
He points out that even with their control freak tendencies, Apple shares some pretty fundamental traits with Google. Both companies are obsessed with user experience,
Right.
They want to create products that are elegant, that are intuitive, and that just work.
That's true.
Yeah.
And they're both known for their design aesthetic,
Yes.
and their ease of use.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're both incredibly innovative.
Mm-hmm.
They're always pushing the boundaries of what's possible with technology.
Exactly. And he argues that Apple, like Google, understands the power of platforms.
Okay.
Think about iTunes, the App Store, even the iPod. They created these ecosystems that other companies could build on, and it fostered entire industries of accessories and apps and content.
So while their approaches might seem completely opposite on the surface,
Right.
there is this shared understanding of how to create products and platforms that people love
Yeah.
and get deeply invested in.
Right. And it suggests there might be multiple paths to success in this digital age. You don't necessarily have to follow the Google Playbook exactly to the letter.
Yeah, this is all very thought-provoking. It really makes you see like the impact of technology in a whole new light. But I'm also curious about the bigger picture. How does Jarvis see this generation Google? How does he see them shaping the future? What does it mean for us and how we interact with the world?
Well, that's what we'll pick up next time on the deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of What Would Google Do by Jeff Jarvis. We've talked about the Google mindset, how it could shake up different industries, and even that interesting case of Apple. But now I want to get into his vision of this generation Google. What does he think growing up in a Google world means for us? For like society, relationships, how we see ourselves?
Yeah, this is where Jarvis gets really interesting. He dives into how constant connectivity, having all that information at your fingertips, how that really changes how this generation views relationships, privacy, even their own identity.
Okay, so let's start with relationships. How does he see the internet changing how we connect with each other? I mean, we're already pretty connected, aren't we?
Think about this. Generation Google is going to experience friendship very differently. Because of social media, online networks, the ability to stay connected across distances, they're likely to maintain relationships for much longer than previous generations.
So like those high school friends, college buddies, even people you just meet briefly but click with, they won't just fade away as easily.
Exactly. The internet creates this persistent record of our connections. It's harder to just lose touch. Jarvis even talks about reconnecting with an old girlfriend through Google. It's like all these connections are just a search away.
It's almost like we're building these extended networks, like a web of relationships that stretches throughout our lives. But does that actually make our relationships stronger? Or just more, well, persistent?
Jarvis actually thinks it could lead to stronger relationships. Knowing that our past interactions, those shared experiences are all out there, it might encourage us to be more thoughtful, more considerate. It's going to be harder to escape the consequences of our actions when there's this digital trail.
That's interesting. It's like our digital selves hold us accountable in a way. But it also raises the issue of privacy. If everything we do online is potentially permanent, does that mean privacy is dead?
Jarvis argues that privacy isn't the core issue. He thinks it should be about control. Generation Google is more comfortable sharing personal information online, but they want to decide how that information is used, who sees it.
So it's not about hiding our lives, but about having agency over how we present ourselves online. Like, we want to be the curators of our own digital presence.
Exactly. And this ties into his belief that publicness, while it has risks, also has huge benefits. When we share information openly, we're contributing to this pool of knowledge that can benefit everyone.
Like he uses that example of patients sharing their health data online to improve treatments and research, right?
Exactly. It's like crowdsourcing solutions to complex problems.
Okay, I see the potential there, but I can't help but think about like the downsides of all this, this hyper-connected world. Does Jarvis acknowledge those concerns at all?
He does. He does worry that relying on Google for instant answers might make us less inclined to, think deeply or rely on our own memories. He even brings up an article called, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?"
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. I've definitely felt that way sometimes, like my brain is getting lazy.
Right. It's a provocative question for sure. But Jarvis pushes back a bit. He argues that the internet, while it's changing how we think and learn, it doesn't necessarily make us less intelligent. He points out that he's learned a ton through online interactions, blog posts, just the constant exchange of ideas.
So it's not about intelligence itself, but about adapting our ways of thinking and learning to this new environment. We need new skills, right?
Absolutely. Critical thinking, evaluating sources, being able to filter and synthesize all this information. Those skills are going to be crucial in a Google world.
It's like we need to evolve our mental tool set to keep up.
Yeah.
He also talks about how the internet is changing our sense of identity, right?
Yeah. He believes that in this world where our digital selves are always on display, our online reputations and accomplishments, they're going to become increasingly important. We're defining ourselves not just by who we are offline, but by our online personas, our contributions to this digital world.
Yeah, he even mentions parents checking domain names before they name their children. It's like our digital identity is becoming as important as our physical one.
It really highlights how intertwined our digital and physical lives are becoming. It's not this separate world anymore.
So where does all this lead? What's Jarvis's ultimate vision for the future of this generation Google? Is he optimistic or pessimistic?
Ultimately, I think he's optimistic. He believes the internet is empowering individuals, it's dismantling those traditional power structures, and it's creating this more open, connected, and democratic world. He sees a future where people can organize without organizations, where ideas can spread rapidly, and where anyone with a good idea and the drive to succeed can make a real impact.
That's a hopeful vision and definitely one that makes you think. I think the most valuable takeaway from what would Google do isn't about predicting the future exactly, but about adopting this new way of thinking.
Absolutely. It's about embracing that openness, experimentation, that focus on the user, being adaptable, data-driven, constantly learning and evolving, recognizing that the world is changing rapidly and we need to change with it.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into what would Google do, here's a final thought for you to ponder. If Google were to tackle a challenge that you're facing in your career, your personal life, your community, what approach would they take? What would Google do?
It's a great question to consider. I really encourage you to explore it. See what innovative solutions you might discover by applying that Google mindset.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We're always ready to take on your next stack of sources and uncover those hidden gems within. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.